Hello classical music fans, this is Rock Omelette again and I'm back with another tutorial video. This time I'm going to walk you through how I've set up all of my bus settings. I'm going to take a walk through the signal path all the way from the instrument track straight through to the end. We're going to show you how I set up the individual bus tracks, depth settings, reverb settings, how I do some of my EQ, and how it all comes together at the end. So let's take a look. So here you have the mixing panel view of my template as of February 2024. So the goal here of this video is going to be to walk through the entire signal chain once the signal leaves the instrument tracks. We're going to go from the back to the front because I just think that's easier to show. We'll start with the master bus here at the end, and the most important thing to see in this track is that I have a brick wall limiter, and this just keeps the signal from peaking like any brick wall limiter does. I have it set to minus 0.1 dB with a very fast release time. This just prevents, big orchestra slams like at the end of Holst's Jupiter, or some particularly strong percussion hits that might be significantly louder than the rest of the ensemble, etc. I do have also on this particular channel Restream, but I don't really use this so much anymore. This is sort of a holdover from when I used to record my videos straight out of Cubase, both audio and video together. But I do keep it here for now in the interest of maybe streaming at some point in the future. Next I have the submaster mix bus, or what some people call the 2 bus, and here also I only have 2 plugins, but these might be 2 of the most important plugins in this whole template. The first is Magneto 2, which is a stock plugin that comes with Cubase. It is essentially a tape saturation plugin, and what this is basically set to the preset master warmth. This just provides a little bit of glue for the overall ensemble on the last track before it goes to the master out, as well as just giving it just a hint of saturation to give it that little bit of warmth in the low to mid range. It's a very subtle effect, to be perfectly honest with you, but after listening to it for so long, as soon as you turn it off, I just immediately notice that there's something that sort of drains the life out of a recording if this is bypassed. So I highly recommend you put some kind of warmth saturation plugin at the very end of your signal chain, just to give it that little bit of a live character feel. I also have what is essentially the stock stereo enhancer. You can use any stereo enhancer here. I have it set to pretty wide. What this does is it sort of accentuates the panning that I have up higher in the signal chain. I use the old Stokowski orchestral arrangement in terms of where I set my instruments. So rather than having first and second violins next to each other on the left-hand side of the conductor's viewpoint, like many conductors do today, I use the more old-fashioned style where I have the firsts panned hard to the left and the second violins actually panned hard to the right. This was actually the standard in the late 19th, early 20th century. Before it was changed by the New York Philharmonic in the 1930s, and then became more prominent worldwide. I just find that it adds a little bit of character and interest, particularly in some of the romantic pieces where you actually get some kind of stereo effects going between the first and second violins. Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony is, I think, a really good example of this, the pizzicato movement that you hear. But more importantly, it also gives a little bit of additional stereo presence to the woodwinds, which are by themselves sound a little bit centralized. This just makes it, this just individualizes them a little bit more, and I just think that it just gives it a little bit of extra character there. Also, I think the stereo width here allows me to have better sound quality and it highlights the solo instruments when they're playing with the rest of the ensemble a little bit more, because it just provides a little bit of separation to your ear by widening the overall stereo field. Okay, now that we've covered the 2 bus and the master out, I'm going to show you what is essentially the full signal path, starting from an instrument track all the way through the various buses it travels, and then ends up at the 2 bus. And I'll use this piccolo track here as an example of how that works. Let me show you where the full signal path is first. Here you can see what the instrument track is. It then goes to a dedicated bus track for this specific instrument, more on why in a moment. Then from there it goes to, in this case, the woodwinds group track. Each instrument goes to a different group bus based upon where it sits in the depth on the stage, and I'll cover that in a moment as well. And then from there, those group buses all are in turn routed to the 2 bus and on. Now, the reason why I do this, a couple of main things. First off, I firmly believe in the many little EQ changes as opposed to one big EQ change. And I think it works particularly well from my use case here, because each sample library is recorded a little bit differently, and it has a little bit of a different sound quality. Also has a little bit of difference with regard to some of the dry versus wet sounds, and more on that in a moment as well. So what I use here is, on the instrument track, some very mild EQ setting. All of my EQs have obviously a low cut to avoid the rumble at the bottom end building up over time. But I do just little subtle changes here for each individual instrument as necessary to just give it a little bit of a crisper, more realistic sound. And then from here, once it leaves the instrument track, and you can see the instrument track has no plugins here. It's just EQ and the low cut. That's it. I also don't do any panning here on the EQ, on the instrument track. What I do, however, is going to the specific group bus track that it goes to. I have one plugin that is the Focusrite console channel strip plugin. A couple of reasons for that. One is, again, 4-band EQ, but this EQ adds a little bit of that warm character that the real mixing board that this plugin is based on adds. So again, going for warmth, going for a more analog, real, natural sound because of the instruments that we're talking about here. I also use this plugin for my primary gain staging as well, to sort of give me the headroom necessary to then cut back as needed to create the overall mix later on. And finally, one of the interesting characteristics of this plugin is it models very, very slight, subtle differences for each of the individual channels. So in this case, it's a stereo track, so you're going to see 2 channels here. So each one of the buses that I have in my template, I have a different channel setting here. Usually, all of the piccolos will be on 29 and 30, for example. The first flutes might be on 11 and 12. Long story short, it just adds a tiny, probably imperceptible bit of variance, but I just think it's a neat little thing, so that's why I do it. One of the things you'll notice here is I don't do any compression on any of these instruments. In fact, I don't do any compression on anything in my template at all, with the exception of 2 specific use cases. One is percussion, and one is the solo vocalists. I will cover that more in depth when I talk about those specific instrument groups in a later tutorial. For now, just know that those are the only 2 that have any compression at all. Other than that, this is pretty straightforward. We'll move on to what I do specifically on this bus track now. You can see that I handle some of the panning as well as the reverb send here. Now, you'll see that there is no panning on this particular instrument, but there are a couple of others that do. You can see some of the differences here. The reason for that is I'm trying to account for orchestral positioning based upon the old-fashioned style, which is first violins on the left, second violins on the right, cellos just in front of the conductor to the right, violas just in front of the conductor to the left, woodwinds in the middle, brass along the back, and the percussion and chorus behind them. A lot of sample libraries have that already built in to their usually their mix blend. I don't generally like to use close mics. I find that it creates a bit too dry. It's too difficult a sound to control. I like to have a little bit of room character here. That's also the reason why I do the reverb sends at this point, because I'm trying to compensate for some of the different reverbs or different, I should say, wetness settings that the various sample libraries have. I've been pretty lucky so far with the wetness of the various libraries that I use. It's all pretty consistent. So you'll see that in this case they're all the same, but some of the pannings are different, and that's where I compensate for it here. Don't really do much gain staging here other than as part of the Focusrite plugin itself, so you won't see that here. There are a couple of exceptions to that, and again, predominantly in the percussion section. We'll move on from that. Now, one of the other things you'll see is when we look at that full signal chain again is each of these instruments then in turn go to a group bus. Now, I happen to have them invisible here, but the reason why I do those group buses is these group buses are actually corresponding to the different stage depths. Now, I also have them set up so that I can, in the event of certain ensembles, maybe I want a bit more of a brassy sound, or maybe I want a bit more of a woodwind sound, or maybe more strings, etc. And I'll adjust these overall groups to compensate for that. But the long and the short of it is each of these corresponds to a depth in the stage. Front is exactly what it is. This would be a soloist for a concerto. The strings are essentially just a meter or so behind them, the soloist. So more in line with the conductor. Woodwinds are a little bit behind them, brass a little bit behind them. Wings are not so much behind the brass as they are way off to the side. So you'll hear a lot more reflections from that coming from the sides. Percussion is behind the brass, choir is behind the percussion, and what I call deep stage is what I use for my pipe organ setting. So it also has a not much, but a little bit longer reverb tail as well. And you'll predominantly only hear the late reflections on my deep stage settings. Now, each of those effects that I'm talking about are corresponding to a specific reverb send here. So I've got essentially just the Seventh Heaven plugin for each of these stage depths, and they're all using the same Boston Hall B setting with a 1.8 second tail to it, with the exception of the deep stage, which has a slightly longer tail. The only difference in any of these particular sends here is, and I'll call up the strings as the example here, you'll see a difference in the early versus late reflections. Everything else is exactly the same. What this does, as late reflections are given more prominence as opposed to early reflections, the perception our ears have is that it's further away from us. So we've got front, strings, then we have the woodwinds, and you can see we have about an equal mix of early and late here. Then after that is the brass, which gives a little bit more late reflections. And then we have the wings, which has a lot more late reflections. Now it's over 2 to 1. Percussion, more late reflections. Early reflections are reduced here. choir, even more so. And then finally, deep stage, which has the most late reflections as compared to the early reflections, and it also has a slightly longer tail. What this does is it mimics not just it being as far away from the listener as it can be, but also with the slightly longer tail, it mimics it being a little bit higher in terms of height. So what this makes it sound like it's the pipes coming out above the stage where the rest of the instruments are being set. And there you have it. That's all of my bus settings from the beginning all the way through to the master out. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you like this video, and leave a note in the comments if you think that I missed anything or if you have any additional questions. I'll be happy to answer them as soon as I can. Stay tuned for more music and more tutorial videos in the very near future. Thanks again, and we'll see you at the next concert.